Hi everyone, Jen here, and we want to welcome you to our Southridge online message. If this is your first time tuning in with us, a special welcome to you. We're glad you're interested in what we're up to here at Southridge as we seek to follow Jesus in community and share his love with others. If you're part of our community but catching up online because you weren't able to join us on Sunday, or maybe it's been a while since you've been able to come to a service, we want you to know we miss you, but are grateful for the opportunity to hear about what we are learning together through our weekly messages in this format. For any and all of us, and as you're able, we invite you to consider joining us on a Sunday morning in either Vineland, Welland, or St. Catharines. Because there's something life-giving about experiencing and sharing the love of Jesus when we get together as a community. If you'd like to connect further, we invite you to fill out our online Connect card. Or if you're interested in joining a group, volunteering to serve, exploring spiritual practices, taking a next step towards baptism, or contributing financially, you can do that all through our website as well. Most of all, we hope you know you are welcome, you are loved, and we pray that Jesus speaks something meaningful to your heart and life this week. Here's this week's message.
Kind of feel like today is one of those good news, tough news type of conversations. First of all, the good news is that we don't have 2 entire chapters of difficult text and complicated literary genre to grind through today like we did a few weeks ago, the last time I taught through our last portion of the middle section of the book of Revelation. Today, we are actually looking at a single verse, get that, and from a New Testament letter. Very straightforward and clear. So the good news is that today is simple. Yay. The tougher news is that I kind of feel like living out the reality of this one verse is probably harder to do than living out the reality that those 2 chapters from Revelation, as complicated as they were, intended to provide. Without re-preaching the message, you can go back and look at it online. Those 2 chapters were all about not predicting something in the future, but painting a compelling picture for something that happened in the past in the form of Jesus' death, not invoking fear, as many people assume the book of Revelation tends to do, but inspiring faith, and not portraying an angry God, but a sacrificial, loving Jesus. And so the takeaway was to be struck by the love that Jesus has for us and to be inspired to a greater degree of faith. Right? In that sense, not that hard, rather quite inviting. Whereas today, I think the takeaway, the so what, when we understand what the passage teaches, is a little bit harder to live out. But if you were here last week, you know that that's the essence of this Lent series that we're journeying through, launching on Ash Wednesday and kicked off last Sunday. We are preparing for Easter, where we are going to increasingly reflect on what Jesus did when he died and rose again, and what Jesus was willing to give up for humanity and for you and me, and consider not what we might want to give up for Lent in like a fad cleanse kind of a way, but deeper in a character behavior kind of way, what we would be willing to give up for love, recognizing that Jesus gave up everything in love for us. And so after launching last week into probably the most significant building block of what we could give up for love in giving up our self-orientation, giving up our me-firstness and our sense of entitlement, today we want to look at what I would feel like is the next most critical piece of the puzzle to give up if we're really going to experience a greater degree of love flowing among us. And so if you brought a Bible and want to camp out on this verse with me today, turn to Ephesians chapter 4, and that's what we're going to dig into. Actually going to read 4 verses because the 3 preceding verses to the one that we're really camping out on today provide some important context. And so we're going to begin in verse 22, where the Apostle Paul says this. He says, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and instead to be made new in the attitude of your minds and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. That's the text and the verse that we're going to look at today. And those three verses of context provide a clothing metaphor that the Apostle Paul uses to describe the work of Jesus in our lives. The supernatural, transformational work of the risen Jesus is like, when we are embracing it, it's like we're putting off an old outfit and putting on a new outfit. We're putting off our old behaviors and habits and values and putting on the way of life of love of Jesus. That's what he's describing using that clothing metaphor. And then he goes on to make a therefore. And this is the verse that we're camping out on today, verse 25. The therefore that is about to list 4 different consequences or implications of putting off the old self and putting on the new self. The first of which is our subject today, what he describes putting off falsehoods. Putting off falsehoods. And it's interesting, in the original Greek language that it was written in, the word falsehood is actually translated as the word pseudos, where we get our English word pseudo, like fake or not real. So I want us to appreciate that the Apostle Paul is encouraging his readers to put off more than just telling lies. He's actually trying to get people to put off living a pseudos, a false and unreal way of life, to put off all the ways that we tend to live in non-reality. And then in the contrast of putting off and putting on, notice that he encourages people to put off falsehood and to put on the speaking of truth to one another, to speak and share and live in truth with one another. And so today, what I want us to reflect on are 4 practical ways that we can do that putting off and putting on, almost like 4 different layers in a sense, where we can put off falsehoods and choose to put on the truth of the way of love of Jesus to allow love to flow among us to a greater degree. So the first of these, if you're taking notes, is not surprising. I think putting off falsehoods obviously means putting off the evading of truth. Putting off the evading of truth, meaning truth that we know, but we just refuse to share it. We know it, we won't provide it. We know it, we won't say it. We're like the Keanu Reeves character in The Matrix. We just kind of duck away and we evade having to share it. But Proverbs 12:17 says this: an honest witness tells the truth, but a false witness tells lies. Right? A false witness evades the truth. And obviously, the telling of lies is the most kind of immediate or pervasive way that we evade the truth. And I'm sure that in a few comments, as part of a 20 or 30 minute talk, I'm not going to convince those of us who are tempted to tell lies to stop telling lies, as if we need to know that it's wrong, because we already know that it's wrong. So for those of us who tend to evade the truth in this way, I would want us to reflect on a couple deeper dynamics to consider. First of all, let's consider that when we evade the truth in communicating lies or falsehoods in that way, in spite of what we might want to convince of ourselves, it's not no big deal. Often we tend to live in the world of these little white lies, but I want us to appreciate that failing to speak the truth is a fundamental contributor to eroding and fracturing trust, and that trust is the most fundamental ingredient in us experiencing relational dynamics of love. Business author Pat Lencioni talks about the 5 dysfunctions of a team, of any group of people. You can apply it to friends and families and other groups, teams, and other things, not just in a work environment. But in his model, you'll see the very bottom layer that teams struggle with is an absence of trust. And if you have an absence of trust, you don't have anything else. And if you have an absence of trust, you can't build anything else, right? Kind of like in a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. First things first is trust. And when trust is gone, you don't have anything. So if we're tempted to evade the truth and fail to speak the truth, especially in telling lies, let's not convince ourselves that it's no big deal. It's an enormous deal, because lies have the potential to fracture and erode trust, and trust is everything when it comes to love relationships. Secondly, let's appreciate that there's more to evading the truth than just a bold-faced lie. Yes, we can convince ourselves that it's a little white lie, sure, but we can also exaggerate the truth. That's not being honest and putting off falsehoods. We can manipulate the truth to say technically what isn't false, but doesn't include certain things, or we can kind of skirt the truth in a certain way, or we can evade the truth in probably the most pervasive way that most of us do, and that is to just omit the truth altogether. We didn't lie. We just didn't say the truth. We refused to say that uncomfortable or difficult thing. And as a result, we actually contributed the very same result that outright lying might have contributed. So let's not convince ourselves that evading the truth in those ways is no big deal. And let's appreciate all the different ways that we could put off that falsehood for the sake of love. Now, as we take off the next layer, let's consider that the opposite is also a falsehood that we ought to put off, and that's the falsehood of denying the truth. To put off falsehoods is to put off denying the truth, not knowing the truth and refusing to share it, but actually receiving the truth shared by someone else and refusing to embrace it. That's what we mean by denying the truth. It's the opposite direction. Proverbs 15, verse 31 says this: "Whoever heeds life-giving correction will be at home among the wise." The proverb teaches that the wise person has a certain relationship with truth when they're confronted with it. Henry Cloud says the wise person, when the light of truth is shone on them, they, like a moth to the flame, they lean into the light and want to change in that direction, in the direction of truth. The fool does everything to try to redirect the light. The wise person redirects themselves toward the light, toward that truth. The fool does the opposite. And so we need to consider how it is that we respond when people are willing and courageous enough to expose us to truth. Do we try to deny it in a way that adversely affects our experience of love? One example of this in my own life, I'll just ask it this way. Does anyone know what this thing is? Anyone out there know? You can put your hand up in your location. What this is. I did not know what this was for years, but a few years ago, Becky started to communicate to me in a more forthright way. And the way that she articulated this, she said, "Jeff, I don't know how to tell you this. You have dog breath. You have dog breath." And eventually, I kind of would deny it, and I couldn't smell it, and I tell her, no, it's no big deal. I pretty good oral hygiene routine, flossing, brushing, and even sometimes brushing wouldn't get rid of it, or rinsing out with like Listerine wouldn't get rid of it. And it got to the point where she wouldn't just say, "You have dog breath." She would just summarize that by looking over at me and saying, "Woof, woof." And it was kind of, man, I guess this is really bad. And she finally said, you got to talk to your dentist about this. And so it finally got to the point, my next dentist appointment, I'm getting the routine checkup. And again, everything is 2 thumbs up, no cavities. And dentist telling me you got gums of a 20-year-old. I'm like, great. My wife says, I got this issue. What's going on? And they said, oh, that's really common. There's certain bacteria on your tongue that your brush can't get rid of. And so use one of these. That device is called a tongue scraper. It's a tongue scraper. And so I got this thing, came home, incorporated it into my routine. And I mean, this is probably too much information, but the first couple of times that you do it, this paste comes off. It's like a pudding in the sink. It's rather disgusting. But I'll tell you, almost overnight, it solved the problem. And finally, there was no more woof, woof, And that's not to say that, Becky or you won't find me with coffee breath once in a while or garlic breath, depending on what I've eaten. But thankfully, Becky doesn't have to deal with absorbing the aroma and the fragrance of dog breath anymore, because I finally was willing to face the truth that she was sharing. The question I think for us today is in our relationships and in the way that we relate and in our behaviors and on our character and the impact we have on other people, what is the aroma that we give off to others? And how do we respond when others tell us the aroma we're giving off to others kind of stinks? You know, if you're like me, you're tempted to deny that truth in one of two ways. One is to downplay it and say, oh, it's no big deal. That's not true of everybody. It's just them. And, you kind of make light of it. The other is to kind of divert the blame of it or divert things to the fact that you didn't mean to have that impact. Right? We tend to focus on our intention rather than the impact on other people. But as Carrie guided us in last week, to put off self-orientation and adopt an others orientation for the sake of love focuses more on our impact on others than our intention behind it. And so one of the ways that we've got to put off falsehood and embrace truth so that love can flow is by putting off the tendency to deny the truth and face it instead. That leads to the next layer, probably flows nicely into what I think is an even deeper layer of putting off falsehoods that involves putting off advocating for half-truth. Advocating for half-truth. This is probably the most common and complicated way that we try to navigate falsehoods in our own lives. Proverbs 18 verse 2 says this, that fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. Right here, the proverb distinguishes between a fuller, complete understanding and what the proverb calls our own opinions, our own feelings, our own beliefs or convictions. And what's important to differentiate there, especially in times of duress or in conflict, is that when we experience things and when we feel things, and you can feel them in your body, they're real to us. And because they're real to us, they are true. They are true. And there's no debate about that. You can't deny that. That is wholly true. But there is a difference, especially in relationships, especially when often it takes two to tango. There's a difference between what is wholly true and what is the whole truth. And often when we try to get out of relationships that are in a difficult place, we try to argue or convince or persuade what is wholly true to us instead of humbly orienting ourselves to the other and curiously trying to understand what is wholly true to them to piece together the whole truth and work through the whole truth together with what each of us experience as wholly true. Right? From a psychological perspective, this is what's often referred to as triangulation. Because in relationships and in life, we tend to live our lives according to, our brains process it according to stories. And in the stories that we tell, there are often three primary characters. There's a victim, a villain, and then a hero or guide. And especially in times of conflict, we'll tend to tell the story according to our experience, where often the other person is the villain and we tend to be the victim or maybe the hero or the guide, without appreciating that they're experiencing the same thing, but because it's from a different perspective, they're telling a totally different story. And those three characters have triangulated and they're assigned differently, where they're probably the victim or maybe the hero or guide, and we're probably the villain. And it's only when we're willing to sit down and reflect on, let alone in conversation, understand and discover how we're experiencing what is the whole truth, not just advocating for what is wholly true to us, that we can actually move through conflict, resolve disagreements and misunderstandings and hurt that we've caused, and experience a greater degree of love. It's only when we put off the falsehood of advocating for our half-truth that we can embrace the whole truth and experience a greater degree of love flowing. Well, to me, that leads into what I would say is the deepest degree of falsehood that we need to put off. And that is putting off the falsehood of forgetting what I'm calling the capital T truth. Forgetting the capital T truth about who Jesus is and how he sees us. What I mean by that is, when you think about these first three kinds of falsehoods and the temptation that we have to evade the truth or deny the truth or only advocate for a half-truth. If we take a step back and ask why we do that, it's because anything beyond that would involve some really big feelings. And if we were to share truth or to face truth or to embrace a whole truth where maybe we're more of a villain than a victim, it would all of a sudden elicit big feelings like fear or even guilt or shame. And oftentimes, because we don't want to face or feel those big feelings, we retreat back and we settle for a pseudo version of life to avoid having to face those difficult feelings. Well, I want us to appreciate that this is the exact context in which the verse we're staring at today finds itself. Let's look and reread those first three verses before Ephesians 4:25. In verse 22, it says, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires." So we can be made new and put on the new self. And, then the therefore of putting off falsehood and speak truthfully to each other. The Apostle Paul describes this old self and this old way of life as being corrupted by its deceitful desires. There are certain feelings or urges that are influencing it. And it's interesting, those feelings or urges he describes as deceitful, and the word he uses for deceitful is the same word as the word falsehoods. It's the Greek word pseudos. That the very feelings that often drive us to evade and deny the truth and to advocate for half-truth are pseudos feelings like fear and guilt and shame. And even though they're very real and strong and palpable to us, they are not the truth of our lives and how God sees us. And so to live this way, the Apostle Paul, through all of these instructions in Ephesians 4, ultimately concludes it this way at the very beginning of Ephesians 5, where he says in verse 1, "Follow God's example, therefore," as a conclusion of all what he's said before, "as dearly loved children." As dearly loved children. What he recognizes is that it's only when we can root ourselves in the capital T truth of how God sees us as dearly loved by God, forgiven by Jesus, unconditionally, by grace, no matter what kind of people, and can see other people that way, that context then provides the possibility for us to put off those falsehoods and live in a greater degree of truth. It's not evading that truth that will enable us to experience a greater degree of love. And I hope that we can detangle that today, because I think, in our day and age, there's a lot of talk about safety in relationships and psychological safety. And often how that gets misinterpreted is according to the content of what we'll provide. And we avoid saying or staring at or understanding the full truth because of the discomfort and those big feelings that come with it. And we define safe as staying away from those big feelings. Safety, though, is not necessarily in the content. Author Sheila Heen, from her book Difficult Conversations, says there's actually no such thing as a diplomatic hand grenade. Saying or facing or understanding real truth is often very difficult, and in that sense, very unsafe. What makes it safe, though, is the context of unconditional, supportive, for you kind of love, the love that God has for us and the love that we can contextualize relationships with. Safety comes from context more than it comes from content. And it's only when we embrace the capital T truth of how God sees us and how God sees other people that we can really live into that life of love by speaking and receiving and understanding the whole truth. So let's consider what would happen if we did that, if we actually embraced more of a perspective of how God sees us through reflection and spiritual practice and, worship environments and community, and it just embedded that truth deeper and deeper into our minds and hearts, how God sees us and how God sees other people. Could we take the steps of putting off those falsehoods and embracing a greater degree of truth in our lives to make the shift from to and to avoid the double negative? in a summative way, could we, on the one hand, tell the truth? Could we not lie and exaggerate and manipulate or omit the truth, but say it more clearly, more directly? Could we face the truth and not deny it by downplaying it or diverting it, focusing instead on other people's, the impact we have on other people instead of justifying our own intent? Could we seek the whole truth and not get ourselves stuck in these triangulating dynamics by advocating an incomplete narrative as real as it is to us? By, in the deepest way, by embracing Jesus' truth and remembering who we are because of him. Like I said, this is a lot easier to understand, a lot harder to live out. I think the simple but challenging call to action today would be to consider even one relationship in our lives where we would love for love to flow to a greater degree. And either in our personal reflection or if we're courageous enough to actually engage in a conversation with that person, could we consider what one truth they most would like us to process, to either hear or face or understand to a greater degree, and then potentially get invited into the inverse, the reciprocal of what one truth ought we to most share with them that could unlock the valve of our minds and hearts and allow love to flow to a greater degree. Final thought before we close, as we consider this one verse, is to consider that it wasn't intended to only speak to those closest relationships where we would most like love to flow. Our spouse or our kids or our bosom buddy, close friend, and lifelong pal. Let's go back one last time to Ephesians 4:25, where it says, "Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body." See, the vision of this passage and the vision of Jesus' way of life was to apply to all forgiven followers of Jesus, by all forgiven followers of Jesus, for all forgiven followers of Jesus. It was to apply to the whole church as a result of the forgiveness that Jesus makes available to all followers of Jesus personally and together. So as we consider in our broader church community how we would love for love to flow to a greater degree, let's maybe look across the room or do some reflection in our own heart of what ways we could put off falsehood to a greater degree and take steps to embrace a greater degree of truth among all of us. So that as we move forward, not just in this Lent season, considering what we would give up for love, we can give up living pseudo lives together and live lives of small and capital T truth to a greater degree, so that Jesus, in and through all of us together, can allow his love to flow. Let's pray. Jesus, as we prepare for that Easter weekend during the season of Lent, we are struck again by the depth of your love for us and how you were willing to lay down absolutely everything out of love for me and others and us together. We are so grateful for that. And I pray that in the context of that love and in the context of how you see us in your love, we would have the clarity and the courage to live out your love in the form of a greater degree of truth in our lives. That through that context, we could provide the content of a greater degree of truth, putting off those falsehoods, putting off the way of living a pseudo life and speaking the truth, hearing and facing the truth, and seeking to understand a more complete, comprehensive truth to a greater degree. Make us those people. Help us to be willing to take those steps, to give up those feelings of discomfort and fear and guilt and shame that might come with those difficult conversations, because we've anchored ourselves not just in what you were willing to give up, but in your deep love for every single one of us. Help us to be guided by that love, empowered by that love to live in your truth to a greater degree. We pray, Jesus, in your name. Amen.